One of the basic core features of the MC is essentially just a state machine, and on top of that we can build pretty much any component model. That's the basis for our MC POJOs, our legacy support for our legacy JBoss MC beans. That was basically the only component model that existed in JBoss 4X and earlier, as well as how you can actually take and use as a basis to extend that to essentially any component model that you want. I'll talk about some of the existing components that we support in the MC, and then what that means for you as a user versus what it means for you as a developer. And then lastly, I'll do a demo of actually integrating Juice, a Juice component model, into the JBoss MC models. So the fundamental notion and why we spent so much time redoing JBoss 5 was that we wanted the capability to have a kernel that we could effectively plug any component model that we wanted to. So we basically moved away from the high-level component models such as Java EE as the fundamental piece or aspect of the application server. So really right now the core of the server is back to a very lightweight microkernel, which was the case in JBoss 4, but it happened to be JMX, and it wasn't really architected and thought about in terms of extensibility across future component models. With the JBoss 5 and the MC, that's exactly what the premise of the new MC is all about. So again, we're, in the application server, obviously we're going to have profiles that support particular standardized profiles like Java EE5, which we spent a lot of time certifying. But as we move forward, that's going to be basically the core of the SOA platform, the EE6 platforms, web platform, etc. So it's really not, we're really not trying to push any particular component model, other than what the customers are asking for. So at its very core, if you drill down into the furthest levels of the microcontainer, it's really just a state machine that has a few interfaces that allow you to define what are the states that you're going to move a component through. All right. So when we talk about deploy and undeploy, you're basically taking a component that belongs to a particular state machine model and moving it through the states. And there's various hooks for integration between those various states in terms of dependency, installing callbacks, so you can do things like dependency injection, like configuring a POJO, like invoking your typical lifecycle methods on the bean. All right. So there's really only a handful of classes that define that core layer, those being the controller. The controller is basically what defines the state model for a given component layer. The controller context effectively is a representation of a component in that state machine, and it holds stuff like what the actual runtime component is, the target. So that could be an MC bean, that could be a JMX bean, etc. It has information about its dependencies, its state, aliases, etc. The dependency items itself is another extensible mechanism, because you can define your own dependencies. So we can have dependencies on obviously other components. You can have dependencies on JNDI bindings, pretty much anything you want. Another key piece is the kernel registry, which is another extensible mechanism. Although it's a controller implementation detail, you can actually control how lookups of components are done within a given state model by implementing kernel registry plugins, and that's actually an example that I'll talk about today. We're basically going to be bridging between the MC components and Juice components, just basically by only introducing a custom kernel registry plugin. Okay. So just a quick look at some of the key methods of the controller interface to give you an idea of what the state machine view looks like. In terms of state manipulation, you have things like install, which is basically just going to run the component through all the states that have been defined for that controller. You can certainly change the state, which basically allows you to arbitrarily move a component backwards and forwards through its state machine model. And as you do that, any life cycles associated with those state changes will be invoked on the component. Uninstall basically will take the component from its current state all the way to an uninstalled state. There's typical accessors for actually getting hold of a given component in a given state, or for example, or utility methods for getting hold of all components that haven't actually reached the final uninstalled state for things like, have I actually satisfied all the dependencies for a given deployment? And then certainly, again, it's an extensible model. The actual states that are associated with a controller are dependent upon some subclass or implementation of this controller model. Right? So you can add states to build up what your model is, and those can actually be added dynamically. So at runtime, you can add a new state or remove states. And the controller state model is what defines or contains the available states for a given controller implementation. The controller context interface, again, is basically a representation of the component in that state model. It contains a name, aliases, the information about its dependencies. The target is the actual instantiated element. Again, that's going to be an MC bean, a JMX bean, typically some type of POJO. Again, it basically is what controls how I move that target bean from the various states. So the install there is the hook, and how do I move an MC bean from, for example, state A to state B. And the install, again, just is the reverse of that. And then you can get basic information on, what is its current state, what is the required state as defined in the deployment, what does it need to get to be a successful installation, and what is the controller mode. And controller mode is basically when a deployment is made, how is this being advanced through its states? And the controller mode is things like automatic, manual, or on-demand. The default would be automatic, so usually a deployment will just automatically move a component through its states. The kernel registry and kernel registry plugin are mechanisms by which you can control how references to components in the state model are resolved, right? So a kernel registry entry is an extension of the controller context. So effectively, it's a way to look up a component. So in terms of the existing MC, JBoss AS, runtime components that exist out of the box, as I talked about yesterday, our new VDF framework actually does implement its own controller model. So unlike previous versions of JBoss, the state of a deployment as it moves through our various deployment stages I talked about yesterday actually is backed by a controller configuration. So dependency management and integration with AOP, classifying, all that stuff is effectively on par with any other component model that we support. And so we can do non-trivial things like have dependencies between deployments at various stages, which is something we couldn't do in the past. Certainly our main component model is the new MC POJO model. We have a custom controller model that supports our legacy JBoss service endings. Those were the *service.xml files you'd see in the past. Aliases themselves are another custom component model. So aliases can exist as components that actually are resolved across component models. And one of the things that we're working on right now is integrating OSGI implementations like Felix and Equinox as a custom controller model. So basically we have the bundle states and would have that as a first class model that we can integrate into the server. So what about other component models? Well, typically, other component models are really just a subset of our existing metadata models, and so we can typically just map their metadata view onto our existing POJO models. So for example, Juice, Spring, and WebBeans, that's basically how they've been done, and I'll show an example of how Juice can fit in. And in general, if you want to add a new component model, one of the first things you'd want to do is, can I just take our existing virtual deployment framework and map that POJO or that view of that component onto our existing metadata model? And then you can effectively just use the bulk of our deployers. So largely you're just mapping the external metadata model onto one of our existing metadata model or our existing component models.